Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. This video is all about the many map sizes and the questions that come along with them. I've always wondered, for example, if bigger maps have more resources, how large they'd all be in real life, and which, if any, give the most room for each player to build. So, does size matter? Let's find out. We'll get to the LudaKRIS map a bit later, but first, let's start basic and figure out how big each map is. Measuring it out in the editor, these are the dimensions of all of the ones in the base game. The unit here is in tiles, which are only visible with mods, but are always present and dictate where buildings can be placed. I think time might be easier to understand than invisible tiles though, so here are the sizes in terms of a Dark Age villager's walk time. If we multiply any of those by root 2, we also get the amount of in-game time it would take for the same villager to walk diagonally across each map. It's roughly an extra 45 seconds on average as you increase the map each time. It may be a bit surprising, but a giant map only has double the dimensions of the tiny map. But remember, with area everything gets squared, so it's actually 4 times as much space. If we divide the area by the number of players, they both end up with the same amount of space for everyone. In other words, we could say they have the same player density. If we do that with all the map sizes, we see there's a bit of variation in that respect, with other sizes being more dense, assuming that you're using the recommended number of players. In terms of personal space, giant and tiny maps have the most, and the large maps, technically speaking, are the most tightly packed. Medium size also sticks out for going against the trend of generally decreasing space for each player as the maps get larger. This would have been a very easy thing for the developers to calculate and make perfectly consistent, so it looks like a conscious decision to push everyone closer together in those big games. Now unfortunately there isn't a recommended size if you have 5 or 7 players, which can happen in unranked games when you're balancing with a particularly strong or weak player. It basically comes down to if you want about 15 to 20% more or less space than usual. With 5 players, for example, bumping it from a 4-player map to a 6-player ends up giving you 41% more space per person. Now that has a big effect on the game. Smaller maps tend to encourage rushing and towering, whereas increasing map size encourages a longer, more booming sort of game. In fact, a host that sets the map size higher than recommended is usually interpreted online as a newer player that doesn't want to get rushed. Now the next thing I was wondering is how large would all these maps be in real life? We'll have to make a few assumptions here and it'll just be an estimate, but luckily we do have people in the game we can use as a reference. As I measure it, a tile is 54 pixels along one of the edges. Likewise, a male villager is about 36 pixels tall. The problem is though, he's not really as tall as he looks, because Age of Empires isn't perfectly isometric. The angles would have to be 30 degrees, and they clearly aren't. Age of Empires is actually something called dimetric projection, and in this case, the top of the map isn't tilted toward us enough to avoid an optical illusion. If the view is changed to proper isometric, he'd suffer a mild case of foreshortening, and his height would drop by about 5%. All that's to say, it will be more accurate if we use 34 pixels as his height instead of 36. Now we need to work out the scale. Remember, people used to be a bit shorter in the Middle Ages. According to the largest cited paper I could find on the topic, the average male height in medieval Europe was 68 inches, or 173 centimeters. By the 1600s, it dropped a bit, so I think we'll go with the average of those two to cover the Age of Empires time period, which would be 5 foot 7 inches or 170 centimeters. That would put the side of each tile at 270 centimeters or 8 feet 10 inches. Again, he's shorter than he looks, so the tile might not appear that large, but it's what the math is telling us. Now using that number, we can come up with some estimates for the size of each map in real-world units. In fact, in case you're wondering, the average player across the map sizes has just under 50,000 square meters of space, or 537,000 square feet. That's a little over 9 American football fields for each player. An entire giant map at this scale only covers about half the Palatine Hill in Rome. As an easy extension, knowing the size of a tile can also let us work out that our villagers are walking a little under 5 miles per hour, which would be a 5-hour 25-minute marathon or 4 hours 29 minutes after handcart. Keep in mind that does assume perfect pathfinding, which is maybe a little generous. But that's enough about distance. Now let's take a look at resources. I was curious if resources are based on map size or just the number of players. First of all, I'm not talking about the standardized set of resources at the beginning of every game. What I want to know about is the random gold and stone piles that generate around the map. Is the frequency of those related to map size? To test it out, I generated some maps of different sizes with different numbers of players, and recorded how much gold and stone they had outside of the standard starting amounts. It turns out size does matter. With 2 players on Tiny, you get 2 extra gold piles of 3 and 1 stone pile of 3 or 4. As you go up in map size, more piles of stone and gold reliably generate. You can expect more than double the gold on a large map as compared to a tiny map, and 4 to 5 times the number of stone. That pattern holds even when you try it with other numbers of players as well. That makes a lot of sense to me from a gameplay perspective. On a bigger map, you want more resources to fight over, and there's more area you'll have to defend with stone fortifications. This is also backed up by things I've come across related to map scripting, and the number of groups and amount of gold and stone in those groups can be set manually when making a new type of map. The big exception is when it comes to cases of extreme overcrowding. It often either won't or can't find viable locations for the extra gold or stone. Again, if we look at a map script, we can see it's easily explained by minimum distance, which prevents them from generating too close to any one player. The point is, if you want those really epic games, large maps are the way to go for a few reasons. Speaking of lots of extra gold on larger maps, how does map size affect trade? Everyone knows long routes lead to more gold, so are the trade lines on the biggest maps better? Well, at a glance, they clearly look better. Bigger maps have longer possible trade routes, which means more gold. But in terms of actual gold per minute, maybe surprisingly, the larger travel time it takes to reach those markets means you're not really getting a much better deal. That flies in the face of convention, and even something I've said before, which is that you should always attempt to make your trade routes as long as possible. These numbers, though, are suggesting you barely do better on a trade route across a giant map as you do across a tiny map. So what's the deal? The fact is, both those things are true. Longer routes are always much better, and going across a giant map is only a little better than going across a tiny map. The big secret is you don't actually get the same gold from trade routes of the same length on maps of different sizes. A 112 tile route that goes the side length of a tiny map generates 63 gold per trip. On a giant map though, the same 112 tile distance only generates 39 gold. Essentially, you're forced to scale your trade routes with the map if you want to keep the same income, which you have to admit is a clever way to keep the gold income balanced across different maps. The point is, it's always a good idea economically to make trade routes as long as possible. So those were the big questions I had about map sizes. Now let's switch to something I've sidestepped up to this point, and that's the LudaKRIS size. It's an extra map in the HD expansions and gets a lot of criticism for its poor performance. Exactly how big is it though? Well, remember the tiny map was a square with 120 tile side lengths, and the giant map doubled that to 240? LudaKRIS doubles that again. It's 4 giant maps glued together, which would theoretically accommodate 32 players. Likewise, remember the tiny map would take 3.5 minutes to walk across? Well, LudaKRIS would take over 14 minutes from one corner to the other. It's entirely reasonable that you could send an initial villager directly to your opponent as soon as the game starts, and have it reach them after your opponent has already clicked up to Feudal Age. In terms of real-world distance, it's over 1,800 meters across, or about 4/5 of a mile. Think back to the giant map taking up a good chunk of the Palatine Hill in Rome. LudaKRIS is more like a big chunk of the downtown. As a reference, just look at the 2-player map there. It's adorable. Now obviously the extra resources generated on a LudaKRIS map are also going to be equally absurd, as well as the potential trade income per trip. Again though, the actual rate of gold collection over time is only about 5% better than on a tiny map. My big word of caution about it though is it often plays more like a turn-based game, which might be your thing if you really enjoy having a few seconds to plan out every move, but I like my real-time strategy games, so I think I'll stick with the regular sizes. One thing you can do if you want to make a scenario with it is try to keep the number of fish and animals to a minimum. I've noticed from experience that taking those out tends to reduce lag by quite a bit. But that's all for this one. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you next time.